All right, welcome everybody. Before we get started, I just have a statement of care to read for you and any others you might know who might be struggling, actually, not just in relation to the conference material. But the tools in this conference are intended to be used to navigate stressors associated with trauma. There are many ways to reduce stress and build resilience, none of which require that you simply push through chronic stress or intense emotions. Take care of yourself first. Acknowledge and honor your experience, whatever it is. If any of the content in these presentations cause you stress at any point, and there's no need to understand why, please contact a mental health professional. And we have a toll-free 24/7 national line that you can call, or a crisis text line, and I'll put those into the chat. So what we have now, it's my pleasure to introduce Michelle Ericksen, and her presentation today is Healing with Psychedelics, Crossing the Threshold with Plant Medicines. For millennia, humans have been using psychedelics for spiritual, psycho-emotional, and physical healing. Western societies are seeing a renaissance of psychedelic use, and science is backing up what psychedelic practitioners have long asserted. These methods work, and in this workshop, we will explore how two medicines indigenous to the Americas, psilocybin and ayahuasca, can inform and support trauma-informed care and healing. Participants will learn how ancient plant medicine technologies are being combined with current science, case studies of how plant medicines create connection and healing of personal and ancestral trauma, and the pros and cons of using plant medicines for healing. And about Michelle. Michelle is a bilingual Spanish medicine woman, teacher, researcher, and coach, the daughter of immigrants from Europe and Latin America. She's been engaged in ritual work and education since her 20s. Michelle's offerings draw from a variety of wisdom and shamanic practices, as well as the fields of education, psychology, neurobiology, trauma-informed practices, quantum physics, and cultural anthropology. She received a master's from Stanford and a PhD from the University of Oregon, and she is an ordained minister with the Universal Life Church. Michelle has lived in and traveled to 45 countries, continues to teach, coach, and do anti-racist and DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion work in Central Oregon. Welcome, Michelle.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. Welcome, everybody. It's such a pleasure to be here and share this time with you. And I come to you today from the homelands of the traditional Hawaiians. I have the pleasure of being out here on sabbatical. So just as a heads up, if you hear a rooster crowing, he's over there. I'm out in the country, actually, so nowhere near the city. And chickens coming by and lots of bird songs, so hence the headphones. I hope it's not distracting. And here we are. So I'm really looking forward to sharing this wisdom with you today and helping us engage in a conversation around the utility and importance of psychedelics in trauma healing work. A couple of things just sort of to walk us through today. What I will be doing, given the platform that we're on and we're not face to face, is I will be sharing my wisdom and information with you for probably about 45 minutes or so. And so I'm going to ask you, if you have questions, please, please, please write them in the chat. We'll devote the last part of the session to answering your questions. All questions are good questions, so I want to really encourage you to feel okay with what you ask. If you're thinking it, somebody else very well is thinking the same thing. So you're giving an opportunity for all of us to have more discussion. One more thing that I want to share with you, I think it's really important that we understand this context that I'm talking about. So we're going to have some common language, and I want to share that with you before we get started. So I will be talking about plant medicines. Sometimes I will use the word medicines. Sometimes I will use the word plant teachers. We use the word psychedelics, and we use the word entheogens. And there's other languaging, but I just want to let you know that these are words and terminology commonly used, whether you're reading, whether you're working with people, you're working in community. So they all are words that we use for the same kinds of plants. And today we're going to be talking specifically about psilocybin and ayahuasca. They are both use psilocybin much more often in North America, and particularly the traditions that we're seeing now in psychedelic circles and healing is a tradition from Maria Sabina, who's from Mexico, a very powerful curandera, and then ayahuasca, whose birthplace is in the Amazon, with a variety of indigenous tribes throughout Ecuador, Peru, and Brazil. Um, and so another bit of languaging I want to share with you before we move forward is I'm going to refer to these as technologies and science. And I want to let you know why I'm doing this. We have a tendency in the West to think that Western wisdom is the authority, and that somehow it's better than traditional and indigenous wisdom. And I completely disagree with this. If we know about human beings only do things that work. We do practices. These practices working with these plant medicines have been ongoing, we know, for at least 3,000 years, perhaps 5,000 years, and even longer when we look at anthropological sites and we look at things that are discovered, whether they're statues or whether they're bowls. And in some cultures, right, these are cultures that are used with oral tradition, so we don't have writing for them. But we can find out through anthropological studies that these practices have been used for very many times, very many years. So I'm going to call these science and ancient technologies. And I think it's really important that we value the work and the processes. Okay, let's talk a little bit about how these technologies are being used. And I have some notes here just because I want to keep myself on order. Oh, this is lovely. Okay, here we go. I also want to talk a little bit about the doctors and medicine men. So indigenous people didn't have hospitals as we do, right? But they had medicine carriers. They have different names. They could be yerbalistas, herbalists. They could be médicos, doctors. They could be shamans, shamanes. They could be ayahuasqueros, people who use with ayahuasca. But these are related to our doctors. They're also based on indigenous wisdom and philosophy and training. The roads for working and diagnosing people in the community were often very lengthy, just as they are here today. So one can be born into an ancestral tradition, right? So my mother was a curandera, my grandmother was a curandera, and that wisdom can be passed down through the generations and through lineage. That's one way. The plants themselves can call people forward. That's been my personal experience. The plants that I've worked with have called me and asked me to work with them. So it's a calling. I think that's a very important part of this work that we're going to talk about, unpack a little bit more later, that there's a calling to be in this work, to both hold the space for the work, but also to be engaged with these plant medicines. And also that for some beings, just like this, there's a shift, whether it's an energetic shift, whether it depends on our belief systems, whether right is the hand of God coming down and touching and say, you will do this work. So just know that there are a variety of ways. And then there's the initiation process, which is very common across all shamanic traditions. Mircea Eliade, who was an anthropologist from the early 1920s, I believe, wrote this tome. It's a beautiful, beautiful book where he's looking at shamanic cultures around the world and comparing different experiences. And one of the key experiences is that most healers, people we would call shamans, also known as medicine men and women, and notice that the language changes across cultures and also across those of us who are white or of European descent, have different names for ourselves. Like I might call myself a guide and a facilitator. Under some conditions, I might be a medicine woman. I don't call myself a shaman. And I think that's important to know, that these languages do change. So there's an initiation process for many people, which can have illness, the necessity of self-cure. It could have a walking with death, and being called and spoken to by spirits and the plants themselves. So we're going to be today talking about this bridge, right, between the scientific and the traditional and indigenous wisdom. And what I want to offer us is that they're not separate, right? They're different sides. There are different perspectives that we're going to look at as we're talking about the power and the resurgence, really, of looking at psychedelics for healing trauma. Um, One more thing that I want to share with you, sort of as a framework for me as a practitioner, is that outside of some of the things in the bio that we talked about, um, my studies with Thomas Hubel, who wrote Healing Collective Trauma, and he talks about, right, we have these three different aspects of trauma, which are collective. We're all living in the collective. We're all feeling in this field the collective traumas, be they certainly wars around the planet, economic traumas that we're feeling, the dissolution of government and societies, right? So that affects all of us to different degrees and varying degrees, right? We carry within us genetically, and this is the field of epigenetics, ancestral trauma. Personally, my parents were born during World War II in Europe. My mother's family in particular, they were bombed. They lost their home 3 times. They had to flee the Russian army. And my mother grew up in East Germany. And so there's a whole lot of trauma that got packed into her DNA that then got passed on to me and my brother. And so one of the reasons that we do, and I personally have started working with psychedelics for healing, is that traditional methods of healing, including working with the medical establishment, because I have a chronic disease, and working through various types of therapies, were insufficient for healing those traumas. Uh, the last piece that I want to share with you that I think is important and relative to this work with psychedelics, particularly through this traditional indigenous perspective, is that Thomas Hubel talks about trauma as energy. Like I think of them as little plastic bags of energy that get locked within us. Very often they demonstrate within the physical body, but they're also in the mental and the emotional bodies. And healing trauma is an essence. I think of it like metaphorically, we're actually taking those baggies outside of our systems. And why that's important and how it marries on to indigenous wisdom is that in indigenous cultures, and I'm speaking generally, not all cultures, but by and large, in the traditions I've worked with are largely South American, but also North American, that we see that trauma, that the outward effects of trauma, disease, addiction, illness, mental illness, depression, anxiety, are manifestations of emotional trauma. So imagine these energy packets that get stuck within inside us or that we can't release. So there's been a huge resurgence and interest and research, and money's developed towards research psychedelics. We know that there was a lot of in the 50s and 60s, and most famously, right, with Timothy Leary and LSD and the Harvard research projects. And then the lack, I would say, or flexibility or flimsiness, right, with having protocols of safety. And then the government came in and sort of like said, oh, we're not doing any of that work. And so all of this work around psychedelic research was super profound, and the results were quite astonishing if you're used to reading research. That got set aside, and the people who were doing this work had to be super quiet about it. So in the last 5 to 10 years, we've seen a resurgence of interest in this work. And I want to say why I think that's happening. I think that we're having a lot of cultural shifts, and I think there's much more awareness about mental health as it affects each of us personally and as it affects us societally. And we're looking for ways for healing. And many of the tools that we have are insufficient for many humans. They're good for certain things, right? Imagine like a particular strategy is good for this percentage of the population, but not good for everybody. So we're looking to increase our tools. We're seeing economic shifts, right? Now there's an awareness that there can be money made on many of these medicines as we and I think there's a challenge there of how we work with that. We'll talk about that a little bit more, and when we talk about pros and cons of doing this work. But there are economic shifts, and we're also seeing the high cost of mental illness. And so I think there is a rising awareness that we need other strategies and we need other ways for people to embark on their own healing. Pause. healing, right? And I want to say healing is not curing. They are different. And that's really, really important for us to know in this work, and really important as we're going to link back to indigenous wisdom. Curing means we get rid of all the side effects, we get rid of all the aspects. Curing, for example, if somebody is at end of life, which a lot of research has been done, this is where a lot of this research started in this modern research around psychedelics, is end of life. People who have been non-treatment responders, for looking at PTSD, for example, has also been a place where we've seen psychedelics really effective. These are people for whom other strategies and treatment programs have not worked. So they're at the end of the line. And the way research works in the United States is that we take the people for whom nothing else has worked, and then we can work with them. And so what we have seen, for example, for end of life, is that psychedelics, particularly the use of psilocybin, I'm going to talk about psilocybin. I'm not going to talk about MDMA. That would be a whole other presentation, and I don't work with MDMA, and it's also lab made. And so the works that I do is working with plant medicines, and I can tell you a little bit more about that in a moment. But what we're seeing is these results that defy current statistics. And so people are saying, wow, whereas we might have a program that's for veterans with PTSD and is cognitive behavioral therapy. And I don't know the data, but let's say for a moment, 15% of people after going through an 8-week program are no longer classified as having PTSD. With psychedelics and with these therapies, after 6 months, it is, I'm going to say, I think it's like 68%, about 2/3 of the people who've done this work and been through these programs working with psilocybin therapies in a therapeutic setting are no longer classified as having PTSD. So the jump in the wellness, in the healing of folks, right, is very large. And I think that's one of the reasons why there's a big interest in this. We also are having a relaxing of social norms, right, and society and scientific mores. So there's more awareness, there's more openness, there's more curiosity in a different way, and I think we are far less dogmatic. Or I should say, I'm seeing shifts in the dogma, and so more opportunities for people to engage in this research and doing this work. And then I also think that we are at a time where we are seeing a return as the earth is on her axis, and we're facing climate change and devastation and destruction across so many avenues and arenas that affect human and all other life on this planet. There are many people who are looking back to the old ways, right? And we're looking back to old cultures and how did they do this, and why are these cultures still around, and how are they still healing and healthy? And we're seeing that there's a lot of value in traditional wisdom. So I think that's why we're seeing a resurgence and an interest in research. There's a lot of research about this. I'm going to just name some things where, if you're curious about this, where you might look if you haven't seen it. Primarily, the research has been linked to both psilocybin and MDMA. My thought is both because they're quite more accessible, and there also is less stigma around them. There's a lot of social stigma still about LSD based on what was happening in the 60s. However, there is some new research on LSD and ayahuasca. And this research is being conducted by highly regarded universities, by Johns Hopkins, by UCLA, by King's College in London. It's one of the few, actually, as a little aside, with ayahuasca, there are about 3 universities that I've seen that are actually doing studies with ayahuasca, and King's College is the premier university. So if you're curious about that, that's where I would look. There's a university in Brazil, and I believe the third one that I've seen is either in Spain or Portugal. And NYU is also doing research on psychedelics, and they're demonstrating the effectiveness of these plants, as we talked about, with non-treatment responders, largely in difficult cases, including end of life, as we talked about, veterans with PTSD, addiction, and anxiety and depression. So the research is pretty interesting. Again, remember, when we do research, we're looking at very narrow bands that we can control and identify. I'm going to talk a little bit as we get deeper into the presentation about what I would call qualitative data, or lived experience, and they are both important, right? So that would be the macro view of what's happening to people that I work with, people that I know, people that I've seen, conversations, books that we've been reading, as compared to research, which is very narrowly focused. And I think it's really important that both of those perspectives are addressed. One more thing that I want to share with you is that we are also discovering that in healthy people, ayahuasca and psilocybin are not harmful substances. And what we're finding actually with thus far emergent research, mind you, is that these medicines, these psychedelic medicines, do not cause addiction. You can actually have them in higher doses. There have been some really interesting research about people given very, very large doses. Yes, shot out into the cosmos and not having a therapeutic experience. However, there hasn't been lasting damage. And I think that's really important. It is important also, and to know that there are some um, right, the key word is in safe humans, and so, or in people who are healthy, so that there are definitely interactions and contraindications. This is not medicine for everybody. And so when working with clients and when we're working, referring clients out, it's imperative to make sure that whoever's holding the space and offering these services does a health screening. For example, ayahuasca actually is very counterindicative for people who, um, oh, I just totally forgot the word. Um, for one thing, it's people with multiple personalities, but there's far fewer people with that. People who've had psychotic breaks, and there's a third group, and sorry, I'm totally blanking, and I will put that in the chat when my brain comes back online with that. So we want to really make sure that holding this space, doing this work, getting training, referring people out, that we know that they are being held in a safe container, a self and healthy setting. All right, I want to talk with you a little bit about the process, and I want to talk a little bit linking it to trauma, personal, ancestral, and collective. And I want to talk about why the pieces where I see that it works and why I think it works. And I'm not going to get all researchy with you because you can go do your own research. So just know that what I'm speaking to you comes from personal experience, from work with my teachers, my indigenous teachers, as well as my credentialed teachers or academic teachers, and also from the research. Okay, so what we know and what we're learning about these medicines is that our bodies are set up with neurotransmitters and receptors to connect, which is pretty amazing, right? So we are already developed with these relationships. Um, and we've done most of this work around psilocybin, so I'm going to speak to that. What we know that happens with psilocybin, particularly in large dose journeys, and I don't think there's enough data to talk about microdosing, so I'm going to talk about large dose journeys, is that it quiets the default mode network, and I think of that as the traffic cop, right? So our brains, like our bodies, want to optimize the work, right? Think of energy as limited. And so sometimes what gets optimized is a looping pattern of thought. That would be anxiety or depression. It gets looping. And think of those Roadrunner cartoons when they're running in circles. And so those neural pathways get more and more embedded. And what happens with psilocybin, and I wouldn't be surprised if it happens with anything else, but I can't speak to that, is that the default mode network, which is the traffic cop, like this is the circle you're going in, quiets down. And that allows the brain to optimize itself. Now think of how mycelium work, right? They're like the internet, right, of the natural world. And so it allows all these different parts of the brain to light up, which creates new opportunities for problem solving, access to memories. Psilocybin is particularly useful for childhood, accessing childhood trauma and memories. Um, it creates opportunities for new creative thought patterns. There are evidences of synesthesia, which is where rather than right, we hear music. When we are in this highly engaged state, we might see music, we might hear colors, so we can have different bodily sensations that cross the normal barriers that we are used to during ordinary three-dimensional life. And so that in itself, right, sort of is exciting to the brain, and then to the mind that comes on afterwards. That would be like the rational thought that when we're doing the integration pieces. So, in the majority of patients that are studied, and again, reminding you that the research is new, these effects, these epiphanies, or these healing opportunities, or this opportunity to hit the pause and review the trauma or the incident from another perspective or another level, right? In the majority of patients studied, these results are long lasting, and that's really super powerful. And again, I want to go back to what I think our medicine carriers, indigenous relations have known is that this works. You don't have to know why it works. And it might be like, oh, the plant spirit is talking to you and healing you and is now working with you, or the gods have come down and healed you. And it's fine. It's all the same. I think the philosophy behind it, whether we stand behind, oh, it's science and it's opening your brain and connecting these neurotransmitters or receptors, is one perspective, or it is opening your heart and you're building relationship with yourself, with these other aspects of yourself. Same. Important to have different languages and different ways to speak about this with patients, with each other, with clients, with our colleagues, that we have an awareness of the sort of 180 degrees of which and with which we can language these practices. Um, Again, I want to really say where I think that this work is very powerful is that when we go back to the indigenous view of illness and trauma, it's caused by an emotional wounding, right? The physical may or may not be a trauma, but it's the emotion that's attached to that. So the emotional field gets, let's pierced or wounded, which translate, right, that energetic field then moves into the three-dimensional material human physical body, or it could move into the mental body, right, with anxiety and depression. And that these energies, these plant medicines know how to, with some, I'm going to say consciousness or intelligence, find out where those frequencies or those dimensions or those woundings occurred and shift. Um, okay, I'm going to move on a little bit. So let's see. Why is this work powerful, and how can we hold the space working with largely Westerners? Um, I've been out in the jungle. I've worked with, particularly, I did training with Shipibo practitioners in the Amazon in Peru, way out from everything. And it is in the traditional community when people grew up together, when the traditional community, and the Shipibo are the people who are the most well known for working with ayahuasca, although there are other tribes, the Shuar and Achuar are other tribes that are quite well known for doing this work, but mostly we read about the Shipibo. Think of it a community growing up together and understanding each other and their own mental processes and their own daily lives. And so the work held in those communities would be drinking the medicine together and everybody doing their own work. Sometimes the shaman drinks for everybody in the community, and now the shift is being like community members drinking, and it depends on each community, does a little bit differently. But there's not the setting of intentions, there's not the doing integration work afterwards. It's quite different. And so when Westerners go down to those places, right, and let's say I have a trauma that I'm working on, I was in a car accident and I have this fear of driving, and I can't get into a car driven by somebody else without this trauma, and I'm ready to heal this, and I decide to go down into the jungle to do this work. One of the things that can happen, if I am not in the right setting and the right context, is I could be re-traumatized, because I might go into a traditional setting and be put in a hammock or put on a spot on the floor and left to do my own work by myself with images coming up. And let me speak to you for a moment about the kinds of things that can come up working with psychedelics, right? We have not all done this work with psychedelics. I talked a little bit about synesthesia. So yes, there can be beautiful colors and sounds and connections with self and memories. And the trips, if you're going to call them a trip, the experiences can be beautiful. And so everybody wants, like, oh, I want the beautiful part, I want the feel good part. A lot of the work is, however, is shining the light in the darkness and taking the icky stuff out of the closet, right? We've been throwing this stuff in the closet for 40 years. And when I open that closet, there's a lot of crap that's going to come out. And if we're not prepared, particularly for those of us as Westerners who are taught to throw our stuff in the closet, right? the person can be re-traumatized or can be further damaged. And I think that's super important that we create and we know how to create that really safe space. So what I want to do is share with you my processes for when I work with clients, when I work with plant medicines, and when I hold the space for clients, and what I found that works most effectively with Western clients. And again, with those of us who are raised and inculcated in the Western worlds, with Western values and philosophies. So I want to share a little bit about that. Critical to talk about set and setting. So what do I mean by that? So the set is the mindset. How are you coming into the space? I work with people. We always talk before we do any journey work or any ceremonial work about coming in and meeting the spirit of the plant, building a relationship. In the indigenous worldview, and for many of us who are non-indigenous but also hold this worldview, everything has a consciousness. One of my teachers says everything speaks and everything wants to be spoken to. And just as we would if I were going to go and work with a therapist, I want to make sure that therapist is a good fit, right? And I want to build a relationship with that therapist before I can trust them. It's no different working with plant medicines. And so teaching people to sit, meditate with the plant itself. If it's available, for example, if a client is microdosing and they're using mushrooms that they already have or that they can purchase encapsulated, or they can grow themselves, and all of that is available, and it's decriminalized in Oregon now, and we're seeing shifts. So I hear there's some changes coming up in the next, by the end of this year or beginning of next year. We'll see what happens here in Oregon and other states. But hold the medicine in your hand if that's possible, or just meditate with it. Check into it before you come and actually sit with it, because you've already built that relationship, and that's important. Then you can get down to doing the work. Setting. So what does that look like? So the work that I do is largely facilitative, largely for private clients, not exclusively. Sometimes we do group work, but the setting is equally important. So creating a space where people feel safe, where they feel held. And what does that mean? Like there's not a lot of agitation. There's this piece that the physical space, because we are human beings, right? We're multidimensional. We see what's around us. We feel the energies, that the physical space is soothing or loving or warm. It's comfortable, right? So that the body isn't all agitated, because these are internal journeys, they're interior. And I want everybody to have the opportunity to access themselves as much as possible. Music can be really helpful depending on which plant medicine we're working with. So often, particularly with psilocybin, doing a soundscape, and that's what Johns Hopkins has done, and you can actually find that soundscape online. I have my own. If you want that one, I'm happy to share that with you. But those are available, and the soundscape helps navigate and helps create the opportunity with different sounds and different energies and frequencies for the self to have a variety of experiences, to optimize being in this non-linear, non-three-dimensional state. Let's see. The other thing that I talk with clients when they come meet with me, and certainly with friends and in the work for myself, is there a call? Am I feeling called, or is it somebody saying, hey, you should go do this work? Oh, go check this out. Go work with ayahuasca because all my friends are doing it. Like, no, this work requires, because we are really stepping into a deep place in ourselves. This work requires, I would say, a calling. And so that's part of the conversations that I have with people as we're working together. This relationship, right, is not just with the plant, but it's also the person sitting with their higher self. They call it their consciousness or their own wisdom. They might be bringing on guides if they have guides, and certainly building a relationship with me, right? Because I want to clear out anything that might create risk or create a sense of lack of safety, and want people to have the opportunity to focus on their inner wisdom and their inner journey without distractions. The values that my teachers hold and that I hold really is that this work is about interbeing, right? We are being with each other in time and space. That would be me the person I'm working with or the people I'm working with, us as a community, the plants that we're working with, and really that we are part of the whole of nature, right? We are not separate. So when we do this work, often what these medicines help us remember and realize that we are not separate from nature. We are nature. We are a unique human manifestation of nature, but we are still nature. And so one of the outcomes of doing this work often are people who feel disconnected come out of these journeys of feeling far more connected, like, oh, I am that. I am love. I am nature. I am, right, part of this earth, and part of the processes on the earth. I'm not like this little disembodied human walking through the world alone. Um, and then, right, knowing that healing comes in so many different forms for each of us as humans. It is as healing is as different for each of us as we are from each other. So being open and open to any kind of healing. The other thing that I talk with clients about is that what comes for them, what comes through each experience, because each experience is different. I could work with 2 grams of mushrooms 15 days in a row, and I'm going to have 15 different experiences. And so each one is unique to where I am in that moment, in that time and space, and in that frequency, and in that physical space, that emotional space, that mental space, and that physical space. And so understanding that every opportunity is its own unique experience for healing and for insight and for growth and for creativity and self-development and self-knowing. I also work with my clients on their own beliefs and their values so that I can speak with them. Some of us are really comfortable with the G word, with God, right? Some of us want consciousness. Some of us want spirit. Some of us don't want spirit. Some of us want to only talk about science. And so I find that being fluent in a variety of perspectives is really helpful, and helps the people that I work with get into their own space. And it helps me in my own space when I'm working with folks, that they use language that works for me, right? No difference. Um, let's see, what else do we need to talk about? Um, what a typical, let's say for a particular client, if I'm working with a personal journey as a facilitator, what a client would experience coming into my home, and I do this in my home. I have a room that's set up, which is a sacred space. Is we've already had the first session about how to be safe and how to navigate. There's been a health screening. We've had at least an hour talking about intention and sort of where, at least prior to coming in, where the person thinks they want to go. And again, that might shift from the moment they walk in. They might want to go in a different direction, but just being open and aware. We create together, often we create an altar, which might be bringing in mementos that are meaningful, of family or of tokens or flowers or rocks or things that want to be there to be of service, in service to hold the space. That's one thing that we do, and that's a really beautiful way to sort of marshal the energies. We do a meditation to ground into the physical body, to clear out any agitation, have conversation for sure, to make sure the person who's coming in with their mindset that is open and available to doing this work. And then there's a ritual around actually the relationship with the plant itself and the plant medicine and ingesting that. And then the client, this is for particularly for psilocybin, the client would lie down in a very comfortable position, and honestly, they go in and do their own work, and very seldom do I intervene. I'm in there to hold the space, to offer if there's water needed or needed to go in the bathroom, to facilitate. It's very, very rare for me to actually interact with them while they are in doing their work. What is really fascinating, and I think this is really important about being in the both set and setting, is holding the space. We'll talk about it, right? Therapists would call it a therapeutic space. I would call it a sacred space or a ceremonial space, which is, like you can tell when you walk in a room that's calm, or you walk into a space that's loving, as compared to a room where there's been a fight 5 minutes before, right? So it's an energetic experience, and I can't say that there's a way that we each in our own way might create that, and that's really important. And then after the journey, there's definitely the opportunity to come out. Clients work on, they do their own writing or some of their own processing. There's food, of course, because the body needs nourishment, and that we need to bring the body back into the human, back into the body, so that they are able to continue on with their work. Um, Working with these plants, often if we keep our doors of perception open, while we might lose the psychedelic experience, the doors of perception and interest in communication can stay open for a day, 2 days, or those doors can just be open. So I'm going to speak about ayahuasca for a moment. Ayahuasca, and in our tradition, you build a relationship with her and she is always part of you. Once you have drunk of her, and she's a female spirit, she is always available to you. So you don't need to drink, consecutively. Many people do, many of us do. We continue our work, and other people, it's a one and done. So the understanding is that once you build a relationship with these plant spirits, they are always available. And I think that's very important. Okay, the other piece that is key to this work and to supporting people in their own work is the integration piece, which means after the ceremony, we do a little bit of sort of check-in, and I encourage people not to be too mental, right? Let that sort of download, write, meditate, be out in nature, let that information come through you, because often it takes several days for it to come through. And sometimes it might be a month later, 6 months later, where you have an epiphany based on that experience. So the information can come through for a long period of time. But really sitting down and having at least a 1 hour session where we walk through what happened, how did you feel, how did you respond, what have been your learnings since then, how are you going to employ what you've learned, and what are the practices that you can use moving forward. Let's say ayahuasca says, or ayahuasca, let's talk about psilocybin because she's easier, or they're easier to work with. Psilocybin says, you know what, you really need to focus on your diet and you need to eat healthier because you're not. And that's part of like creating agitation in your body. So then we would have a conversation about diet and how to create more supporting systems, and some strategies, right? So that's where sort of more of the behavioral aspect comes into that. All right, I want to talk with you really briefly about some case studies. I'm really short, and then probably for another 6-7 minutes, and then we'll open up to questions. So thank you for being along with me thus far. I want to share with you because it's important that you know like why I'm here. Personally, I came through a lineage of a lot of ancestral trauma. I grew up in a home with quite a lot of personal trauma. My parents, and then my own coming up for the childhood abuse, and I think undiagnosed PTSD for myself, which led to an autoimmune disease in my 40s. And I went through the whole medical system, and got to the place in the system that like you will never heal, you will always be chronically ill, you will be on this medication for the rest of your life, and you will only continue to get worse. And there was a part of me that was like, oh, hell no, like I don't believe that. That's what it took for me. And that was what precipitated my work, going and working. And the first psychedelic I worked with was ayahuasca. I actually went down into South America to do this work because I was ready to be done. I was ready to like really crack the stuff wide open. And my thought that I was going to go and heal my physical body. And this is where the medicines are really powerful. They're like, oh no, there's so much other stuff to do. You have so many other things. And so this journey for me has been about 5 years, and it has offered tremendous, tremendous healing and insight and growth and personal development. And it brought me to the place really where I feel like I am who I came here to be. And that for me as a human is super profound. And I'm here doing the work that I came here to do. That said, right, it's a long journey, and I have used these plant medicines in conjunction with therapy, in conjunction with meditation, in conjunction with yoga, in conjunction with being out in nature and looking at my diet. And so they are not a standalone, for most of us. Perhaps for some of us they are, but for most of us, they are what we do as part of our healing journey, right? And a part of our self-awareness and understanding. So I will probably be on this journey forever. However, the way that I work with these plants has altered, and also the frequency has also shifted. So I want to say that. So I want to share with you two other stories. And these are both people who work in the healthcare industry. One of who's a 48-year-old female who talks about working with ayahuasca. And I'm just going to read their experiences to you so that you can hear in their own words. The first time I worked with ayahuasca, I was responding to a loud spiritual calling that felt manifested, uh, that felt something like a deeper curiosity and almost immediately manifested as the opportunity to work with her, right? So the intention and then the experience opened wide up. The result of the experience has so far unfolded as a 12-year journey of healing and learning that I believe would otherwise have taken lifetimes. It is said that when one commits to working with a plant medicine teacher, there is a clear exchange and commitment between the plants and the student. The plant provides healing and learning in exchange for a life of service to the greater earth community. My healing was physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. And I want to circle back and just say my experience is the same, that there is a reciprocity in the Quechua tradition, which is one of my traditions. We call that Aini. Some of you might be familiar with that word, that we are in service then. The plant is in service to us, and we make a commitment to be in service to the plant as well as to humanity, to the earth, to the planet, that we are, again, remember, right, we talked about, we are part of the sum of nature, the sum of the whole. And so there is a, I will help you, will you step in and help? Um, I think that's really powerful and important. A 38-year-old male says, many times I've experienced increased clarity and a shift towards a more simplistic perception of a situation or aspect of myself that I found troubling, unclear, or perhaps did not previously have an awareness of before the medicine experience. I like to equate this experience to a car windshield. After driving, aka living, many miles, debris, layers of conditioning, programming, diversions, distractions, and fallacies start to build up, making it difficult to see the road. You spray the windshield solvent and the wipers clean off the layers of junk so your windshield is crystal clean. This is the ayahuasca experience. I would describe my healing as being emotional, mental, and spiritual, but it is all connected. And this realization in particular has been paramount in healing and personal growth. Lastly, I said that we would talk a little bit about the pros and cons. This is a constantly unfolding conversation. It is dynamic. It needs more voices. We particularly need to make space for and invite people to the table to do this work, for communities of color, for marginalized communities, for indigenous communities. Many of the people who hold the space in the Western sphere are educated, privileged, often academic. And while those voices are important, we need to have room for everybody to be part of this. The people that I see in our circles are most often well enough to do because it can be expensive to do this work. And more often than not, people who are upper educated, professional, and have disposable income. And I think all of those things need to be remedied so that these medicines and these opportunities are available to everybody. So what I think the challenges are, or the cons of this, right, is access. We need to avail access. We need to avail the open this up. And we also need to be clear that this is not the medicine for everybody, just right. Like lithium is not going to be the medicine for everybody, right? Or a particularly antidepressant is not the medicine for everybody. There might be other avenues. Privilege needs to be discussed. It needs to be unpacked. We need to explore how and why. We need to have integrity in the relationships with the plants, the teachers and stewards of these plants in their original native communities, and the traditions from which they come. We need to understand, those of us who work in these traditions need to hold space and be grounded in them and have a deep sense of understanding and reverence for where they come from, and have permission from the stewards and the medicines themselves to do this work, right? We don't get to, this is not transactional. I don't get to use this because I think it's good for somebody else or myself. Legality. Certainly the need for more scientific evidence as part of the collective, as we talk about more communal experience as well. And the regulation piece I find really challenging. This is not the place to go into that, but I am concerned and heartened both to see us opening up, and also really concerned when I've seen what's happened with cannabis, which can be another potent medicine for some people, not for all, when I've seen what happens in the cannabis industry and how many people actually have been damaged by that. So it's both and. I think the pros are, these are natural medicines with little to no physical side effects, except for perhaps in the very, very immediate, right? Where people are having emotional experiences. You might be crying. There might be throwing up for some people with ayahuasca, but the long term, they're incredibly healing, overwhelmingly healing. They are relational. They create community. They relate us to the larger community, nature, unity, consciousness, which most things don't do. And this is a staying thing. It's not like you're taking a pharmaceutical, which as soon as you stop taking it, then you come back to whatever your stasis, your low level stasis is. They foster self-agency. They foster self-awareness. They foster continued self-exploration and healing processes. So encouraging people to go on their own healing journeys in powerful, potent ways. Personally, and I have seen this over and over again, these plant medicines connect us. They connect us back to our source of self. They connect us back to whatever higher consciousness that we have. They connect us to community. They help us build tribe of people that we do this work with, that we recognize each other as brothers and sisters in this human community. They connect us with other aspects of nature, right? With the four directions, with the elements, with the plants and animals. They connect us with the spirit world, with our ancestors. And that's all really, really powerful information, and powerful for us to walk through and create a better world, which is really ultimately, I think, why we're here. We want ourselves, our family members, our communities, our clients, our colleagues to have better lives and to be able to move forward in a healthy way to conserve, preserve, steward, heal ourselves and the planet. So we have 9 minutes. Thank you for bearing with me. I took an extra minute. I'm here for questions. Okay, question. Here's one question. Let me read this question from Cheryl. Why would you use one medicine over another? That's a really good question. Excuse me. They do very different things. It's like saying, why would you use one pharmaceutical drug, or why would you use this surgery over another surgery? And this is where it's really important to have trusted resources. And I would say this, there's a variety of ways to figure out what the right medicine is. One is check your intuition. Two is do your research. There is a wealth of research out there that you can Google. There's research. There are websites you can go to. I'm going to bet that every single one of you has far more people in your lives that are working with these plant medicines than you know, because we are just starting to talk about it. Microdosing seems to be a way for many people to step in a very gentle, easy way. There's some really great evidence, and more research is being done on that right now. There's 2 very large studies that are being conducted. And talk to your people, talk to your physicians. I really encourage people I work with to talk to their primary care, their therapists, to talk with their RNs, their physicians, because the more that we share this information, the more it becomes destigmatized. And so those are the ways to figure out why. And they, like I said, they do different things. So that's why you would choose one over the other. Right? There is no one size fits all. And I will say this, the way, for example, let's say you and I we sit next to each other, we take the same dose of psilocybin, we're sitting in the same space. Let's say we even have the same intention, right? We're going to have vastly different experiences because my physiology is different, my personal history is different, my DNA is different, my thought process is different, so we will have vastly different experiences. And so just know that what works for one person isn't necessarily going to work for another, and they don't work in the same ways. Okay, what other questions do we have? Thank you for that question. Is behavioral therapy part of the work with the use of these plant medicines? I think that's a question for a therapist. I'm not a therapist. Personally, as an educator, having done a lot of work, we used to do, what was it called on education? It was based on cognitive behavioral therapy in my doctoral training. And so we look at all behavior has a reason. So we're trained to look at the behavior and then look at the context of the behavior and then look at what instigates the behavior. So what is the significant event that instigated the behavior? So I would say yes, and right. Some of us are trained in looking at behavior through those lenses. If I were a medicine woman in a tribe, I would have a very unique perspective on that, right? Which would be based on my cosmology or my religious beliefs. Um, I do believe that for these, whatever the epiphanies are, or whatever the understandings that are offered to us in these healing contexts, that for them to actually be integrated into us for healing, there's a behavioral component of the person who receives that information, right? Whether it is, right, you need to meditate more, or you need to eat better, or, right, your ancestors want to speak to you, right? There's a something that is being asked of us, whether it is a shift in understanding, awareness, or behavior. And shifting our understanding is a little bit of a behavioral aspect, because I have to make the conscious effort, right, to shift over here instead of shifting here. So both and. Okay, what other
Okay,
questions do we have? Great
I'm
question.
gonna I'm gonna pipe in here because I'm gonna fess
Yes,
up.
please.
That was my question.
Oh,
Um,
thank you.
and one of my concerns, particularly with the legalization of the psilocybin in Oregon, is if the use of that is to just uncouple the emotion from the trauma, so that you're not activated by those memories and that kind of thing, so that you have, I mean, let's say, for example, you have a maladaptive coping strategy like drinking, or addicted to drugs or something like that. Does that strategy go away, or do you actually need to work on that part of it? If does that make sense?
Yeah, if I'm understanding you, you're talking about uncoupling the emotion from the behavior. And I think that that's
Yeah.
a very dualistic perspective, that we use very much in the West, but as not the indigenous perspective. So there is not this polarity between this thing and this thing are the only two things that interact. And so what I can speak to, um, and I don't know the research particular to addiction. Um, so I can't speak from that perspective. But what I can speak to is that the perspectives of doing this at work is that it's far more complex. That what can happen for people, is that all of a sudden there's a clarity, and that whatever it was that was causing the person, let's say, to abuse alcohol, could just go away. Whatever the need was could just, whatever, be gone. Or there might be more thought process behind it, or there might be a recognition that I come from a lineage and I need to work with this lineage. So there is not this is how it works for everybody. And there actually are other medicines that work, well, from what I've seen from the literature, that work better for addictions, that within a period of 5 or 6 days, it is, hold on a second. It's not Bufo. Um, I'll have to get back to you on the name of the other medicine. There's a couple clinics down in Mexico that use this other medicine, that can do that for however they work, and I'm not familiar with them, so I can't speak to them. So I think that we're talking in a pretty mechanistic way, looking at it through that perspective, Cheryl, and it doesn't layer onto the indigenous wisdom.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for that clarification. I
Yeah,
appreciate it.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
because that might be, again, something that just comes up as people look at this.
Correct. And I think there is research about that. If you read it right through the annals of psychology, and if you're looking through those particular research documents of the researchers who work with addiction, they are going to be using the psychological terminology. But what I do want to say, what happens when we decouple that, or we look at it from that binary, we are missing the fact that there's an emotional connection. We're missing the fact that there's a unification. We're missing the fact that it's about the person accessing their own consciousness. And so we are again looking to have then put these little Lego building blocks and put a person into a little building block place. And I think that that is problematic personally. And I think it's problematic with how we work with trauma. And so that's why I think that this work can be very powerful as an alternative or addition to more academic therapeutic interventions.
Okay, great. Thank you
Okay,
so much. I don't have any other questions that came up, but what I did do is I put Michelle's email
great.
into the chat so that if you do have other questions later, you can shoot her an email. And
And I'm going to
so,
put down also my website,
oh,
just because
perfect.
if
Yeah,
somebody
yeah.
wants to see what I'm up to, there's my website. I'm at yourwisewoman.com. Um, and so that also gives you an oversight of what I'm up to in this part of the world outside of the DEI work that I do. But I also say, like, they are not separate, right? This work that we do together is holding all of the spaces, which is the complexity of, I think, for any of us in doing this work. So I want to thank folks for their time, for their energy, for holding the space. I'm sorry I can't see you because I really love seeing your faces, but I am here and available. So please reach out to me if you have any other questions. And thank you again, Cheryl and Haelan House and your team for creating this space and this opportunity for us to talk about healing together and how to move forward and support each other.
Thank you, Michelle. We really appreciate it. That
Yeah.
was a great talk. I was fascinated.
Thank you.
And I'd love to learn more, actually. So up next, we have a 15-minute break. So y'all can grab a snack, walk around, take a break, and then come back for either affirming gender and identity through trauma, a queer physician's perspective with Dr. Ariel Porto, or the NIA technique for trauma healing with Paula Chambers. So have a break and we'll see you shortly. Thank you.